So we're on chapter 18 in your U.S. history book, and we're going to go over the politics in the age of industry. When we talk about the age of industry, another name for this age of politics and the age of industry is called the Gilded Age, and we'll be talking about that in the next chapter. But during the age of industry, the presidents during this time we're going to go over. The 18th president of the United States was Ulysses S. Grant, 1869 to 1877. The 19th president was Rutherford B. Hayes, 1877 to 1881 was his presidency. The 20th president is James A. Garfield in 1881, and he was assassinated a few months into his election. And on to the 21st president being Chester A. Arthur, 1881 to 1885. He was the vice president that took over from Garfield. On to President Grover Cleveland was the 22nd president, 1885 to 1889. And Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd president, 1889 to 1893. And then Grover Cleveland was reelected. He wasn't consecutive, but Benjamin Harrison in between those elections, and Grover Cleveland, 1893 to 1897. And then the last president that we're going to talk about here is William McKinley, and he was the 25th president of the United States in 1897 to 1901. And he has some pictures of here. So here we have, kind of like moved here. There we go. So we have Grant, Hayes, Garfield, Chester Arthur, Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, and William McKinley. The age of industry. So let's begin. Traditional laissez-faire. What is that? Well, the laissez-faire type of politics, basically, individual freedom was cherished, and the U.S. Constitution limited federal control of business to regulation of foreign and interstate commerce during this time. And laissez-faire meant letting business do as business pleases. Laissez-faire means just being lazy, let it do, whatever. That's the French term. And to promote business, but not to regulate business. So laissez-faire, traditional, is they didn't want to regulate business. But rise in big business demanded economic policies, of course. So there'd be a rise in big business where the government would have to step in certain situations. So here's a picture. He who leads least leads best, laissez-faire. In a hammock there. And then we have laissez-faire is an economic philosophy developed in the 18th century that opposes any government intervention in business affairs. So traditional, that's the way they wanted it to go. But of course, it didn't. The possibility of it. So during the time of Ulysses S. Grant as president, 18th president, the Grange formed. Well, what is the Grange? Well, the Grange was the National Association of Farmers, either called Patrons of Husbandry. Husbandry meaning farming. Oliver Hudson Kelley was a guy's name. In 1826 to 1923, he was employed as the Department of Agriculture. In 1875, 20,000 local organizations with 1 million members came under the Grange, under Oliver Hudson Kelley. This gave farmers a chance to discuss problems together, and it appealed to the state to adopt laws to regulate. What did the farmers want to regulate? They wanted to regulate the railroads, because of course they used the railroads as transportation to bring in farm supplies and to take their products out. They needed the railroads, and certain railroads industries were charging higher prices to them and than others. They weren't regulated on charging fares and charging the farmers these rates. And so the Granger laws were to force the railroad to charge equally equal freight, not to charge some farmers more and some less, or some distances, shorter distances more, or basically change the rates every week or so. They wanted to have equal freight for equal rates. So in 1886, the United States Supreme Court sent a precedent down, an opposite precedent actually, as the Granger laws were trying to enforce equal freight and have the government enforce the railroads to charge, be equal and charge inequality, right? But the U.S. Supreme Court ended up setting a different type of precedent. What was this precedent? Well, Illinois regulation, they said, was unconstitutional. So Illinois decided that they were going to set the rates for the railroads, right? And so it went to the court and was considered unconstitutional to set these rates due to the regulation of interstate commerce, which was reserved for the federal government. So in Illinois, basically saying, no, the state can't do this because railroads, they don't just go through the state of Illinois, they go interstate, in between states. So Illinois could not set down the rates of the railroad. So the Grangers then tried to reduce the cost by organizing their own little co-ops, or cooperatives, they call them. So the Grangers put together these co-ops so that they could talk to other farmers and other Grangers to see what the rates they were being charged and such with the railroads. And they purchased supplies to sell to farmers, but financially were unsuccessful and discontinued. What are they talking about there? The Grangers then, they tried to do these co-ops to help the farmers, and they also tried to set forth different supplies to help them, but all of these things kind of fell at the wayside because the Supreme Court had set this, that to regulate interstate Congress was the right of the federal government and not the state government. So basically, to know all of this is to know about what the Grange was. The Grange was Oliver Hudson Kelley, the Department of Agriculture, trying to set forth, and this Grange that was employed by the department, but it's on the side to help farmers to be able to co-op and talk to each other about things such as the price of the railroad freight. Okay? Let's talk about Grant's life. I'm going to put a little bit of each president as I go in here. So Ulysses S. Grant, we kind of went over him already, especially because he was that Civil War hero. In fact, he was the very general that at the ending of the Civil War that General Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox. So he was a hero, and then he was made the 18th president. He became the youngest president in history from that time, so he was young in age. His administration was tainted with a lot of different scandals, but he wasn't involved in any of these scandals. Basically, knowing that President Grant did not have a really big political career before this, they took advantage of his not being knowledgeable in these things, and there were a bunch of scandals underneath his presidency. Well, Grant came out of nowhere from Ohio. When he was a young man, he was drawn to horsemanship, which became very evident during the Civil War the way he handled a horse. He had an abolitionist father who was totally against slavery, and so was he, I could say. And his mother was very quiet like him. Grant was a very quiet, conservative person. His father sent him to West Point, where they learned to go into the military, actually, and learn to be a general. But he was an average student. He really, really didn't want to go to West Point, but his father actually commanded him to go. And so as he went, he was okay. He never really thought he'd be a great person or a great general. And the academy at West Point had no charms for him at all, and he was glad, in fact, to be out of the academy. His name was Hiram. It wasn't Ulysses S. Grant, actually. It was Hiram was his first name, but it was printed wrong at West Point. And so he went by the name that they called him at West Point, which his name was Ulysses, but there's no S in his name, but he kept that anyway because it looked like Uncle Sam, U.S., So, but his name was really Hiram. Later on, he was engaged to Julia Dent, and her father basically did not like to have her or to have him as her husband. He wasn't really fond of his son-in-law. He just thought he was an underpaid soldier and he would never make much money. And, so he thought he didn't have a lot of, good thoughts, I should say, or thoughts of Grant's future as being a good husband to his daughter. So, Julia Dent's family had slaves, and gradually she inherited those slaves, but after that, Grant actually set those slaves free when he inherited them. He was against slavery. When they were married, it was delayed by the Mexican War, and so he became a general in the Mexican War, and Grant and himself never really liked war times at all, but during the Mexican War, he did become a great soldier. Grant was not good at any business at all. He went after the war. He had business endeavors, and he failed in all of his business endeavors. He was very depressed at times, and when he got away from his wife, he drank too much. Later on, they probably would label him as alcoholic, although in the last part of his life, he stopped drinking. He actually died of throat cancer because he smoked so many cigars. And so he was reduced to selling firewood until the Civil War. So you see his life is pretty uneventful. He doesn't have any heroic deeds during this time until the Civil War. So General Grant's presidency. Ulysses S. Grant and Julia were very close. And she gave him much advice even during his presidency. She was a very popular first lady, and in the evening, she would meet with the members of the cabinet along with President Grant, so she would come and listen. Another thing, he inherited slaves but freed them despite his drastic financial state. Well, that's before that. And in the Mexican War, he fought under Zachary Taylor, and Zachary Taylor would become one of the presidents of the United States after that. Or should I say, Zachary Taylor had become one of the presidents of the United States before that. So anyway, going on, the thought of war was wrong, but he thought war was wrong, but he was so against the spread of slavery. And in the Civil War, he was became a Northern general. Abraham Lincoln, the president, named Grant, saying that he was the unconditional surrender general, because Grant would always say, unconditional surrender, you must surrender unconditionally. And this became his motto, in fact. He became the greatest general in the Civil War. And Abraham Lincoln said, I can't spare him. This man fights, and of course, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. The night that President Lincoln was assassinated, Grant was supposed to be at the theater that night with him, sitting next to him. But Julia, Grant's wife, was not fond of Mary Lincoln at all. So basically decided that they weren't going to go to the theater because she didn't want to go. She wanted to go visit her family instead. But later on, Grant was very upset with this because he thought he should have been there. Because if he was there, maybe he could have protected Abraham Lincoln, but it never happened that way. We know the assassination by John Wilkes Booth in the theater. As a president, he was not very politically inclined, so people loved him, but he was glad really to get out of the political realm. After he got out of the presidency, he said, thank goodness I'm out. So he wasn't really fond of being president. He was a good soldier. He was a great hero, a fair man, a loving husband, very bad in business endeavors, but he had a love of country, and he was surrounded by all kinds of scandals, but he was never involved in any of the scandals himself. In fact, Mark Twain became one of his close friends and later on wrote his volumes of memoirs. The last things that Grant did at the end of his life was to write down his memoirs of all of his life and going over all of the Civil War and everything, all of the memoirs. And so after Grant finished those memoirs, he died just a couple days later. And those memoirs became famous. And actually, before he died, he wrote his memoirs, he needed the money because he had lost everything in a business deal which he was involved with his son's business endeavor. He lost everything. So after he died, his memoirs went throughout the country. Everyone wanted to buy his memoirs, and so his wife later on and his children were benefactors of his book, which Mark Twain published for them. So Grant, before he died pretty much in a pauper-like state, I should say, losing everything, but then gaining everything. I do know before President Grant died that he went to revival with D.L. Moody, at D.L. Moody's revival, and made a commitment to Christ before he died. So, President Grant. On to the next president. The 19th president was Rutherford B. Hayes. He had quite a few different issues that he had to go through. Hayes was a very honest president, and his wife, too, was involved. She was involved in a lot of things going on in the White House and in the Capitol. In fact, she was very against alcohol, and so she basically would not allow alcohol in the Capitol. So the people would call her, a lot of the politicians would call her Lemonade Lucy. But anyway, let's go on with Rutherford B. Hayes. What was going on politically? Well, the farmers, of course, during the Grange that was formed during Grant's administration, the farmers wanted federal government to increase money in circulation. And when you put more money into circulation, this is called inflation. But when money is inflated, the value of the dollar is decreased and prices go up. And this can lead into a bad economic circle and put a whole country into depression, because inflation leads to depression. But the farmers wanted to increase the money because they wanted to pay off their loans, because many farmers had bought land with loans, and they thought if they could increase the value of money, they could start paying off their loans more quickly. This brought in some issues, like the greenback issue was in circulation from the Civil War. During the time of Lincoln, he put forth greenbacks into circulation. And at that time, now, the greenbacks were not backed by silver or gold. They were just money that was issued. And so now Congress had decided we should probably withdraw from circulation all of the greenbacks used during the Civil War. And any paper money that was not backed by gold, to take that out of circulation and decrease the money, but this would increase the value of the dollar. Well, this became a big issue because, of course, the farmers did not want that happening, especially now, because if it would decrease the value of their money, it would take them more to pay off their loans. So now we have a political issue. The Greenback Labor Party was backed by the Grangers. Remember, the Grangers are organized for the farmers and small business. And this Labor Party formed to increase greenbacks. They wanted more money in circulation, so that basically to pay back their loans and such and everything, they thought it'd be a good idea. President Hayes supported backing greenbacks, but to back them by gold. So he didn't really want to go against the Greenback Party, but he wanted to make sure that they were backed by gold instead of putting more greenbacks in circulation, which would cause inflation. So the greenbacks were halted at that point, and basically they never produced any more greenbacks. The Greenback Labor Party actually went into oblivion, basically disappeared. But then the coinage of silver became a big issue because they thought, well, things are backed by gold, but maybe we should have silver in circulation is backed by silver instead of gold. Because silver, we went west, as you go west, they found a lot of silver mines, and silver became more abundant than gold. So the free silver in the 1890s. So let me put this up a little bit so you can see how kind of like, there we go. Okay. So the free silver issue in the 1890s. So the coinage of silver was to switch from cheap money to basically putting the money backed by silver, like I said before. So the previous money had been backed by silver and gold with different percentages, and they were fixed. But now with the silver mines in the West, they had brought in much more silver, and silver was more devalued at this time because there was more of it. Silver was not sold. The silver was not sold to the United States government, but it was not sold to the United States government, but became more profitable to sell to the government. So basically that's just saying that they decided, well, we can sell silver to the government now. And so the Coinage Act of 1873 failed to allow the coinage of silver. And then the Band Allison Act of 1878, the purchase of limited amount of silver each month. So they had to regulate this silver because the silver came and more freely, of course, again, inflation would come with more silver in circulation and the money backed by silver. And silver would be an ongoing issue in politics and the economy at this time. Over and over, the free silver issue, all the way, we're going to find this all the way into the beginnings of the 19th century about silver and gold issue, on which this is important with the money because any type of inflationary activities could ultimately cause a depression, as the economy would switch from inflation to depression, to recession, and then depression. So the basis of the free silver movement, adding more metal to the money supply in order to back paper currency, will stabilize the value of the dollar and help control deflation and inflation. So that's what they were thinking. If there's more metal being coined, there will be more money in circulation for people to use and buy goods and services. And this will stimulate the economy, which was very stagnant at the time. That was the basis of the free silver movement. Also during the time of Hayes, labor strikes and violence started happening. So individual workers organized themselves into what was called labor unions. The thought was that labor unions basically could strike, and that would be the best way to achieve their goals. Even though most labor unions opposed violence, most of these strikes ended up escalating into violence. And Americans began to equate labor strikes with violent uprisings. Needless to say, socialism may have been taking opportunity here to promote unrest. What does that mean? At this time, there were communists and socialists coming in that thought if we can make things violent in the midst of the economy, especially with business and labor, then we can make, to that point, we could come in and fix it, and everyone will know, basically, we need more socialism and communism. It's just a tactic that they use. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 ended with the loss of lives and disruption of property as they had a labor strike. And then President Hayes had to call out troops in the midst of this strike, one of the first presidents to have to call out troops for labor strikes. So what the labor strikes are, basically they're standing up and striking, standing up and not going to work and striking against certain goals that they wanted their business to like more better conditions or more money paid. So the strikes were between the employer and the employees. So here's some pictures here of some violent labor strikes. On to a little bit more about Rutherford B. Hayes, President Hayes, and Lucy, his wife. So, as we already went over in the prior videos, Rutherford B. Hayes, when you think of him, you must think that he had the most disputed election in history, probably up until this time, right? Against Tilden, which he was a Democrat from New York. Both were politicians that were noted for their honesty and basically supported by a great many of people, a great many of voters. Rutherford B. Hayes was backed by Mark Twain. So a lot of people liked Hayes at this time as a good candidate, and they also did with Tilden. Tilden was known for standing up against crime and violence. So that night, Rutherford B. Hayes went to bed thinking he had lost and that Tilden had won the popular vote. And in the Electoral College, it came forth in 4 states there was a discrepancy. So they had to recount the electoral votes in those states. And so Hayes had honesty and dignity, and he looked to moderate reform. So in the midst, going back to this recount, they recounted it, and then when they recounted it, Hayes became president. And he became an honest president. He was educated at Harvard Law School in Cincinnati, Ohio. He was a Whig lawyer. Whigs always were against slavery, we know that. And he was also a general in the Civil War. And he was wounded in action. So he stood up like Grant did as a general. Some of the first presidents were all generals in the Civil War. Cincinnati made him he was basically in Cincinnati as a Republican in the war, and he was 3 terms the governor. But during the war times, they wanted to keep him as a politician, and he said, no, an officer is not to abandon his post in crisis, but to be an electioneer ought to be scalped. So he's basically saying, if I was an officer and I was sitting in a politician electioneer, being elected as a politician, I should be scalped because I need to be fighting for my country, is what he's saying there. He was known for the withdrawal of Northern troops in the South. So after he became president, one of the controversies back then was they wanted the military to be withdrawn from the South. And basically, Rutherford B. Hayes did that. The first thing he did was withdraw the troops that were in the South in the Reconstruction time so that the military presence would not be in the South anymore, especially during his presidency. His wife, Lucy, she was a college graduate. She was a very educated lady. And again, she was called Lemonade Lucy because she didn't allow any alcohol in the White House. She didn't think politicians should be gathering, drinking alcohol. She was also a promoter of women's rights to vote, and she was into abolishing racism too. Those are some things about Rutherford B. Hayes and Lucy. So I'm going to go on to James Garfield, but we're going to go on into the next video, and we'll talk more about what happened after Hayes. Just remember, during Hayes was the Reconstruction time of the South, because it was after the Civil War, and that he withdrew the military, that his election was in controversy, very controversial. In fact, they still think Tilden may have won, but in the midst of all that, they agreed on electing Hayes as president. So let's stop there.